Okay, I'd like to thank Doc and Vladimir and Berus for inviting me to this interesting workshop. So my topic today is inclusive fiscal policy in Asia. In other words, how does developing Asia use or leverage fiscal policy to promote more inclusive growth? Of course, in terms of growth, developing Asia has had a stellar record, right? For the last 4 or 5 decades, it has been, by some distance, the world's fastest growing region. But now that we've reached certain income level, China, for example, is an upper middle income country now. The focus is much more on promoting equality, right? In other words, reducing inequality. Okay, so my presentation, right, will have 4 main parts, but I will also conclude with a special topic on tax administration, because unlike in advanced countries, tax administration is very important, right, for mobilizing taxes and non-tax revenues and fiscal resources generally in developing Asia. And after that, if there's time remaining, or perhaps before that, I will conclude with 3 big thoughts or big ideas or ideas for discussion that I added today, earlier today, this morning, to my sets of slides. Okay, so if you look at this is a story that most of you probably know, where's this? Okay, so developing Asia, if we compare it with other parts of the developing world, right, whether it's Middle East and North Africa, right, and economic stagnation there, of course, and lack of entrepreneurship, lack of private sector development, of course, that contributed greatly to the mess that we have here, Arab Spring, right, economics. Of course, you can talk about religious reasons and all that, but if you have millions of unemployed and underemployed young men, right, young men with raging hormones, of course, that's going to create problems. And not surprisingly, economically, complete lack of dynamism. Government is the only employer, and the government is already over bloated, right? It's basically acting as the employer of last resort, right? And of course, Latin America did somewhat better, but still nowhere near as dynamic as developing Asia, and the same goes for sub-Saharan Africa. Perhaps the most important byproduct of our rapid growth is that there's been a sharp reduction in poverty, as you can see, okay? This is the cumulative reduction in poverty rate between 1990 and 2010. Of course, since 2010, it has fallen even further. So these blue dots, average GDP growth rates, and this bar, red bar or orange bar or brown bar, is the cumulative reduction in poverty. Okay, but so far so good. But one problem we face in Asia is that income gaps are widening. In other words, inequality is getting worse. So this includes China, this includes India, this includes Bangladesh and other countries with large populations and a different income level, from high-income Korea, right, all the way to Laos, PDR, and the other low-income countries. So for the region as a whole, we are facing a problem. It's certainly not an Asia-specific problem. It's a global problem, rising inequality. Of course, that ultimately explains the way many people see it, including myself, Brexit, election of Donald Trump, and many other things we see in the world today, or in recent years, to be more precise. Okay, so if you look at the international experience, especially in advanced countries, because advanced countries have a much longer history of using fiscal resources, fiscal spending explicitly to reduce income inequality. For example, by investing in public education, public health. Of course, these are really the 2, by far, right, the 2 best uses of public money, taxpayers' money, because they help to promote equality of opportunity. But in Asia, of course, the primary focus of fiscal policy was, because we were a very poor region, right, until quite recently, was to promote growth. Of course, some of these growth-promoting investment also help to reduce income inequality. For example, investments in public education, right? That's good for growth. It's also good for reducing inequality. So, but as I said, we've reached certain income levels. So in countries across the region, one prominent, well-known example is China's Harmonious Society Initiative. Because we are now a predominantly middle-income region, people across Asia are paying more attention to inequality and what to do about inequality. So we face a dilemma as a region. How do we use fiscal policy to promote more inclusive growth without compromising one of our region's strongest assets, right? Macroeconomic stability. And underlying that macroeconomic stability, we've had fiscally responsible governments. We didn't have populist, short-term oriented governments spending left and right, stealing a lot of the money and distributing what's left over to the poor. By and large, we were free of that kind of fiscal populism. So how do we maintain that, which is so vital, which is critical to long-term growth, while at the same time doing more, right? Doing more to using fiscal policy more to promote more inclusive growth, okay? But of course, to do this, in all likelihood, you can talk all you want about cutting waste and mismanagement and so forth, but realistically, to use fiscal policy to fight inequality, at least some expansion of public spending will probably be required, but then again, that jeopardizes, as I said, our fiscal sustainability. So there's this trade-off. I mean, Korea, there's the whole region, there are many stories of governments doing very little. These aren't really big programs, but these are fiscal programs that promote equality, but they provoke a very big backlash. Why? Because they threaten public finances. So what to do? Of course, at the end of the day, what that means is we really have to do more to expand and deepen our revenue base, while at the same time, we carefully calibrate, adjust our spending to promote more inclusive growth. So and now I turn to public spending before I look at public revenues and before I conclude. But if you look at the public spending, it generally has a bigger impact on reducing inequality than revenue, right? Revenue or taxation or revenue policies. That's true for advanced countries, but it's also true for developing countries. Does that mean revenues are not important? By no means, because you need revenues to finance this higher spending for inclusive growth. So we ran some simulations, and it clearly indicates that, as I said, one of the two best uses of taxpayers' money, public education and public health care. Of course, you also need education reform, right? Because as we all know, many of you also probably here sending your children to private schools, right? Because the quality of public education can be so dismal, right? But anyway, in principle at least, more investment in public education, public health care, best use of taxpayers' money. And it does seem to have an impact on reducing Gini coefficient. In other words, promoting inequality, and likewise for public spending on health. Okay, and of course, transfers and infrastructure. In particular here, what I would like to emphasize is that I'm going to return to this point. I have about 10 minutes left, it looks like. I'm going to return this point later on. A lot of government spending itself makes inequality worse. Why? Because it goes to the middle classes, and this is going to be one of my main themes, the upper middle classes and the rich people, as a matter of fact. So fiscal policy itself, forget before we can even talk about using fiscal policy to promote inclusive growth, let's do fiscal reform. Let's reform fiscal policy as it is, so that it is not so biased toward the middle classes and the rich, right? High income classes rather than the poor. And of course, there's a logical reason for that, because in every country, of course, the middle classes and the high-income classes, these are the people who wield the political power, right? Whether country is democratic or not, right? In both kinds of countries, you have these people who are the political power holders, not the poor. Okay, so relative to other regions, we still lag in fiscal spending, not only relative to rich countries, but also relative to our main comparator, similar middle-income region, right? Asia's major comparator region. It's not Africa, it's not other, it's Latin America, not only relative to OECD, but also relative to Latin America, our main comparator region. And on top of that, poorest 20%, richest 20%, our fiscal policy, as I just said, is biased in favor of the richer segments of the population and against the poorer segments of the population. So fiscal policy, as it is makes inequality worse, right? So forget about spending more at this point. Let's reform fiscal policy itself throughout Asia. And then this, of course, shows that most of the public pension benefits in China go to the rich rather than, and very little. It's a scandalous difference, isn't it? Of course, even in rich countries, you do have this difference between high income and low income in terms of the public pension benefit it gets. The difference is because there are a lot of transfers, so it's nowhere near as scandalous, right? There's this big, huge, this gaping gap between what the rich get and what the poor get. Okay, so composition matters. Now let's go to move forward to public revenues. And of course, a lot of our governments still do have some fiscal space, although this is the rich country average, world average, Latin America average, and this is the developing Asia average. So we still do have some fiscal space. Of course, that's a vague concept, but it's safe to say we have more fiscal space than other parts of the world. Of course, that's more true for, let's say, China than it is for India, but nevertheless, for the region as a whole, we still do seem to have some fiscal space, but that can be deceptive. Why? Because among other things, we as a region are aging very rapidly, and that means more public spending on pensions, more public spending on healthcare coming up. So if we take that into account, we have much less fiscal space than we think. For example, pensions, healthcare, pensions and social security, big future fiscal demands. And then even now we have relatively small, limited revenue base. And then we need to, therefore what it means is that we really have to strengthen our revenue mobilization across all these different categories of tax revenues. And these are some of the things that we can do for a deeper and broader fiscal revenue base, okay? And then we can also do things like these kinds of sin taxes, right? These kinds of sin taxes, a study we did indicates it will be good for both equity and also as a source of revenue generation. Okay, finally, I think we need, in terms of what we can do more innovatively, Asian countries can use something called a medium-term fiscal framework for inclusive growth. It's a little unwieldy title, but the basic idea is let's systematically incorporate equity into the fiscal framework in the medium term. And of course, we can also do other kinds of innovative stuff. For example, strengthening public-private partnerships. I know that public-private partnerships is often a meaningless, contentless mantra, but if we do that well, if we really do that in a concrete way, that can also help to increase our fiscal space, so to speak. So by way of conclusion, and I still have about 5 minutes, so the point is fiscal policy. Yes, we can and should use fiscal policy to promote inclusive growth. And of course, if we really want this to happen, Asian governments must do more to actively and explicitly incorporate equity into their fiscal planning, into the medium-term framework, for example. And but this, although this is a long-term challenge, it cannot be done overnight. The time to start planning for a more inclusive fiscal policy is here and now. Now, I think you can, because of lack of time, you can read this on our own. It is a paper I did with 2 joint researchers, and we basically come up with a measure of tax administration effectiveness, and we compare the performance and tax administration effectiveness of the Indian states. We do a study on Indian states, and then you can read that on your own. But I do want to conclude with the three big ideas. This is just to highlight the importance of tax administration in developing countries, right? Unlike advanced countries, which have a well-developed and mature tax administration base. Okay, so let me just conclude with what I thought is three big things. This is something I already touched upon. In developing Asia, fiscal policy is often itself. So forget about expanding fiscal spending and all that stuff. Let's start with reforming fiscal policy because it is itself often a major source of inequality. For example, although there have been, look at this, for example, there have been reforms recently. Indonesia, until recently, scandalous. They had these huge subsidies for these big luxury cars, right? I mean, Mercedes-Benz and Lexus, what have you, and all these. Of course, in Indonesia, still a relatively poor country, relatively few people own cars, and you have such big subsidies for these kinds of gasoline. Of course, that's anti-poor. It makes pro-rich, makes inequality worse. So we need to really concentrate on fiscal policy reform even before we talk about fiscal expansion. And that's really a big part of promoting more inclusive fiscal policy. Secondly, this I really believe is the key, fiscal policy, it's because really the big problem in economic growth, and I've really come to realize this, recognize this over the years. I mean, I've been in academia, right, before I joined ADB. About 11 years ago, I was at NTU in Singapore. But I mean, I spent throughout my 20+ years in this economics profession, what I've come to conclude is that what really, you can run all these kinds of regressions and governance and government infrastructure and all this stuff. What really matters for economic growth, right, at the end of the day is, does that country have a dynamic, right, risk-taking, profit-seeking, entrepreneurship, and private sector? In other words, capitalism in the best sense of the word, not 2007 financial Wall Street capital, 500% self-bonus with so-called financial innovation, which are not innovation at all, but fraud, basically. Not that kind of bogus capitalism, but entrepreneurial, Steve Jobsian capitalism, creating a new product, socially valuable new product, that kind of product. And of course, fiscal policy can help to create an enabling environment for that kind of entrepreneurship. And very much related to this point is my last point for today. There's a lot of empirical econometric studies on corruption. What is the economic cost of corruption? Some of those studies find, oh, cost is very big. Others find cost is very small. It's just another kind of tax. Other studies find it's somewhere in between, right? But to me, it's a vastly underestimated. Why? Because this kind of government corruption, it deters it kills entrepreneurship, it nips entrepreneurship in the bud. Because becoming an entrepreneur in a developing country, let's say India or Bangladesh, a lower middle income country, for example, or Nepal for that matter, that's a more low income country. But anyway, it's already so difficult as it is, right? You have a lot of red tape, and then on top of that, imagine these kinds of government bureaucrats whose dull, lazy eyes light up only when they sniff a bribe opportunity, and then you have to deal with, and what that means is, it's basically a tax on risk-taking, because it's already difficult as it is to become a successful, even in rich countries, we all know this, right? 9 out of 10 entrepreneurs fail, even in rich countries. And in poor countries, the odds are even longer. And then of course, when you make it against all odds, some lazy, risk-averse, dull bureaucrat, he takes 50% of that. Then if you were that potential entrepreneur, would you want to be an entrepreneur? The answer is a loud no. And that really kills entrepreneurship. It kills private sector development. And ultimately, it kills economic growth and dynamism. Okay, that's it. Thank you.